Friends, we're continuing our series, Faithful Regardless, and it's the exciting adventures in 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel. And this is a study of what Samuel has done as establishing the first king of Israel, and eventually how his kingdom was destroyed and deteriorated, and that was Saul. And now Saul has become a murderous madman. And his son Jonathan and the new hero, David, have a very close friendship. And it was determined that Saul was intent on killing David and maybe even killing anyone who stood in his way. And Jonathan, in a secret meeting with David, notified him of this. And that's how we ended 1 Samuel 20. In verse 42, it said, Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have a sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord. And the Lord is my witness between you and me, between your descendants and my descendants forever." And then David left, and Jonathan went back into town. And now what they had established was a covenant relationship, a covenant friendship, a friendship sworn by oath before the Lord. So David left Jonathan. David left the house of Saul, and he is on the run. He knows he's running for his life. He is desperate, and he becomes hungry and desperate. And he decides to go to a place called the city of Nob, N-O-B, the city of Nob, which is a village of priests, because he needs bread, something to eat, and he needs a weapon because he's all alone. Pick it up in 1 Samuel 21, the very first verse. David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" And David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king has sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I do not have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread there, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread except the bread of the presence that has been removed from before the presence of the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken." Verse 7, "Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg, the Edomite, Saul's chief shepherd. And David asked Ahimelech, 'Don't you have a spear or a sword here?' 'I haven't even brought my sword or any weapon because the king's mission was urgent.' The priest replied, 'Well, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It's wrapped in a linen cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no sword here but that one.' And David said, 'There's none like it. Give it to me.' And then he left." Verse 10, That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about when they're dancing? Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands.' And David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence, and while he was there in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Achish said to his servants, 'Look at the man. He's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?'" All right, we'll pause there. So you see, David is on the run. He goes to the city of Nob, which we'll talk about, and then he goes to Achish in Gath. Gath is Goliath's hometown. This is a Philistine town and a Philistine ruler, and he's acting like a madman. David is becoming very mad in and of himself and the things he's saying and the things he's doing. And while he's on the run, we see David makes this grave mistake of taking his destiny into his own hands. When he left the house of Saul, he decided he was alone. He needed food. He was desperate. And so he's decided to rely initially on his own resources and his own cunning and his own strategic plan instead of the Lord. Instead of relying upon the Lord to provide, he decided to go to Nob, a village of priests and their families, and lie to them. He lied to them. He didn't tell them that he was on the run from Saul, who was trying to kill him. Instead, he told them in verse 2, "Oh, the king, Saul, has sent me on a message and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I'm sending you on.'" You see, he told Ahimelech and the priests that he was on a special mission that was sanctioned by Saul, when it was quite the opposite. He was running from Saul. This was a lie. But because he was such a popular hero, or maybe he was just very convincing, Ahimelech the priest believed him, and then he offered him the showbread, which according to Leviticus 23 could only be eaten by priests. And remember, David is not a priest. He's not a Levite. He's from the tribe of Judah. Well, this is a problem, because David is not to eat, no other tribe is to eat that bread. That's the bread of the presence, the showbread, and it's used as part of the sacrifice and the presentation before the Lord and offering before the Lord. And when it's done being presented, it can be eaten, but only by priests. So that's the only kind of bread they had there. Now, David was desperate. And this problem was talked about by Jesus. Jesus talked about when his apostles were eating, grains and heads of beef, of bread and wheat along the road, and it was on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees got down on them, and Jesus said, well, what about David? He ate the bread. But here's the thing. It was still in the context of a lie. David came here and presented himself as an official on a mission from Saul. And one of Saul's servants happened to be there that day, Doeg, the Edomite, who really is the villain in this chapter and the next. So he's Saul's chief shepherd. But because David did not come and say, hey, I'm on the run from Saul. Instead, he said, I'm on a mission from Saul. He sent me here, official urgent business from Saul. Well, it got Doeg's attention in the village. In fact, when David asked for the weapon, he lied again. Remember what he said this time? He says, well, I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the mission was urgent. Once again, he's deceiving Ahimelech the priest, and he is also making Ahimelech open to exposure by Doeg, the informant. David was saying that this mission was done under the authority of the king, and since Ahimelech responded by giving them the sword of Goliath, he did this not in secret. He didn't supply it, in a way that was covert. In fact, he probably did it openly in front of Doeg, the chief sheep shepherd of Saul, who turns out to be a snitch. This resulted, folks, in very severe consequences. Not necessarily for David, who ran off to Achish and was acting like a madman. And he ends up working for the Philistines later. But for the people of Nob, for Ahimelech and the chief and the priests in the village of Nob, they were all slaughtered at the request of Saul by Doeg in the very next chapter. It's awful. If we jump ahead to that part of the next chapter, 1 Samuel 22:13, Saul said to him, to Ahimelech the priest, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today? And in verse 18 and 19, the king then ordered Doeg, because no one else would, you turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He put also to sword Nob, the town of the priests, and its men and women, its children and infants, its cattle, its donkey, and its sheep, everyone. David's visit to Nob was deceptive. David's visit to Nob was catastrophic. He went, all he needed was bread and a sword. But instead of begging for a loaf of bread and a sword, he connived, he deceived. And this lie and deception led to the death of the whole village of priests and their family by this madman, murderous King Saul, who is pretty much insane at this point. And David admitted it. This is not just my conjecture. I don't hear many people talk about this, but David did admit it in that same chapter. In fact, in 1 Samuel 22:20, he says, it talks about this. One son of Ahimelech, that priest, named Abiathar, escaped, and he fled to join David. And he told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And then David said to Abiathar, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I am responsible for the death of your whole family. At least he admitted it. But what could he have done differently? What could David have done differently to avoid such a catastrophe? And what if he had been honest and confided with Ahimelech and told him the truth? Ahimelech, I'm on the run from Saul. Hide me, feed me, send me away secretly. What if Ahimelech had given Ahimelech enough time to say, okay, I'll work with you, David, but we got to get rid of this guy Doeg, who I know is Saul's snitch. And perhaps Ahimelech could have helped him secretly, like Jacob had hid Moses in the basket in Egypt, or like Rahab hid the spies in Jericho. But instead, no, David made Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob complicit in his offense, his crime against Saul, who once again, is a murderous dictator, mass murderer, madman. And because David brought Ahimelech and the city of Nob into his lies, into his predicament, unknowingly, they all lost their lives. David did not come humbly and honestly to Nob. He came with a deceitful agenda, selfish ambition, not concerned for them, but only concerned for himself. Now, David made many mistakes in his life, and he also did great things. But this is one of those regretful mistakes. He wasn't thinking about others. He was thinking about himself. Philippians 2:3-4 says this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or empty pride, but in humility consider others more important than yourself. Each of you should look not to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. David lied. When he lied to Ahimelech, he was only thinking about himself, not what this would do to Ahimelech and the priests of Nob and their families. And as a result of his seemingly insignificant lies, white lies, seemed like it only pertained to him. They were so benign. As a result of that, he brought destruction upon all of them. Proverbs 12:22 says this: the Lord detests lying lips, but he delights in people who are trustworthy. In 19:9, it says a false witness will be punished and a liar shall be caught. And in Proverbs 10:9, it says, whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his way crooked will be found out. We learn from this. When we lie to other people, we not only condemn ourselves, but we also feed others falsehoods that can cause them to misstep and cause them to make grave errors. Example, perhaps you're an alcoholic. You're not telling anybody. Your doctor says, do you drink? You say, no, I don't. And he prescribes medication, maybe some type of opioid or painkiller, which when mixed with alcohol can be fatal, can be lethal. And he didn't know. He prescribed it to you, and you deceived him. And maybe you get really sick or even lose your life, but you make him complicit because you lied to him. This is similar to what David did to the city of Nob. That's why it's so important to be truthful and really to recognize the destruction and the problem of lies, the importance of truth and the problem of lies. I want to talk about that a little bit because we live in the information age. What's information age? It's all kinds of messages. We're overcome with and overwhelmed with information in all kinds of forms. And in that information, whether it's benign information, factual information, false, whatever it might be, in that is always, in no short supply, an abundance of misleading messages, false narratives, propaganda, deceptive advertisement, and misinformation. And we are, barraged by this, bombarded every day with the cacophony of lies every single day of our life, day in and day out. And this has been going on for many, many decades, not just years. So what does this do to us when it's raining down misinformation and falsehoods and lies upon us? What does it do to our perspective on the truth? What does it do to the influences we have, our attitudes, the decisions we make, and the worldviews that we form? What does that do to us? Well, the world will tell you truth is relative. Moral relativism. You may have heard that term. In other words, everyone decides their own truth based on their own individual perspective. So what's true for you may not be true for me. Or even more importantly, what's truth for some is not truth for others. Now, this kind of thinking of no absolutes and no absolute truth has seeped into education, seeped into politics, and sadly, into the church. Yet, the Bible speaks about truth as an absolute. John 16:13 says, "But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own. He'll speak only what he hears and tell you what is yet to come." John 17:17, Jesus' prayer to the Father, and says, "Your word is truth." God's word is truth. And Romans 1:18, one of the most sobering messages on truth, says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness." You know, these days we hear a lot of news, we read a lot of posts, we receive a lot of messages constantly, like never before in history. Let's face it, constantly receiving messages, reading news, getting stories sent to us, and reading posts and articles and seeing videos, whatever it might be, constantly, like never before in history. So that means we have to constantly be on guard against falsehood. We need the Spirit of truth to guide us into all truth. That's what we read in John 16:13. That the Spirit of truth, he, not it, the Spirit of truth, to guide us, really, I would say navigate us into all truth. Here's why. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says, "The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." You see, there are false teachers out there. And when we say that, it's usually, well, you know, there's false teachers that teach false doctrine. And yes, of course, that exists. Jesus mentions it, Paul mentions it, Peter mentions it. But there's also those outside the church who don't stand a chance to stand upon truth because they're so prone to falsehood because of what we just read. The God of this age, the devil, has blinded their minds. And their purpose is to deceive. His purpose, the devil, is to deceive even the elect, the chosen people. That Matthew 24:24, Jesus talks about in the last days. Even if believers can be deceived, he'll do it. That's the purpose. That's his goal. 2 Peter 2:1-3 says this, "There will be false teachers among you, and they will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who brought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Many will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth into disrepute. In their greed," notice the word greed, "these teachers will exploit you with fabricated stories." And verse 19 of the same chapter says, "They promise freedom while they themselves are slaves to depravity. For people are slaves to whatever has mastered them." Isn't that a very accurate truth? People are slaves to whatever has mastered them, whether it's fear, whether it's addiction, behaviors, whatever it might be. We're slaves to whatever masters us. So be careful. Be careful what you read, what you hear, what you allow to influence you. Because there are those who wish to deceive you and bring you into their destructive ways, as we just read. And they present themselves as authorities. You know, those that know it all. Authorities by some of those, in fact, they're deceived themselves. It's an interesting dynamic because they believe that they are authorities of truth when they really are just perpetuating and propagating deception. You see, they're deceived, so what they tell others what they know, and others tell them that, and you see how it goes on and on and on. Deception spreads rampantly, propagating deception. So what does Jesus say? Well, the same thing he said to the Pharisees, who were doing the exact same thing. Matthew 15:14, "Leave them. They're blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, they both will fall into the pit." Isn't that interesting? If the blind lead the blind, they both fall into a pit. That's what Jesus says. That's why it's so important to seek God's truth and not be coerced by those who do not seek God's truth. Don't be influenced by people who don't believe there is a God. Now listen, there's truth in the world. There is truth in certain parts of science, certain parts of factualization, certain parts of veracity, as some philosophers call it, things that are real or verifiable. But there's much deception as well. If someone does not believe in the truth of God, then their point of view and their basis of perspective is suspect, is flawed. Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So is it hopeless? Is it impossible to find truth in the world? No. No. In fact, the belt of truth, which is the first item that's listed in the full armor of God in Ephesians 6, when he lists the full armor of God, it says, Ephesians 6:14, so stand firm, put the belt of truth around your waist. And what is that? Girding yourself with truth, which is speaking, hearing, and basing your life upon truth, and more specifically, upon the truth that comes from God and his word. You can know the truth. Jesus tells us that. You can know the truth if you abide in the word of God. And then when you know the truth, because you're abiding in the word of God, you will be set free. You'll be free from fear, free from anxiety, free from indecision, free from the bondage of that which can master you. As we read earlier, you'll be free. Free. John 8:31 and 32. I want to close with this. This is the final word. Who gets the final word? Jesus gets the final word. And he says this. He said to those Jews who believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. If you abide in my word, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So how do we find truth in a world full of lies, being bombarded with lies and deceptions? Simple. Abide in his word, know the truth, and you will be free. So let's continually seek that. Let's continually abide in his word. Let's continually seek his understanding and his spirit. And like we read in John 16:13, that the spirit of truth would guide us into all truth. God bless you.